A millionaire got his housekeeper pregnant. His entire family and friends laughed at him. But 7 years later, everyone was shocked. The Carter mansion stood like a fortress of opulence on the outskirts of Manhattan, its grand pillars and sprawling gardens a testament to the family's generations of power and influence. It was a house that radiated wealth, where every chandelier sparkled like a galaxy of stars, and every room told stories of deals made and fortunes secured. But behind the glimmering façade was a world steeped in whispers, a stage for secrets and scandals that everyone in New York seemed to relish discussing. William Carter, the heir to this empire, embodied the Carter legacy. Tall, strikingly handsome, and impeccably dressed, he moved through life as though it owed him something. Known for his shrewd business sense, William had turned Carter Enterprises into a juggernaut of success, yet his personal life was another story entirely. Tabloids thrived on tales of his fleeting romances, his penchant for extravagance, and his seemingly hollow charm, despite his undeniable intelligence. William often found himself at the center of rumors, a target of both envy and disdain. Amid this whirlwind of glamour and controversy was Emily Johnson, a 24-year-old woman who couldn't have been more different from William. Emily worked as a housekeeper at the Carter mansion, moving quietly through the halls with a diligence that often went unnoticed. She had grown up in Queens, raised by her grandmother after losing her parents at a young age. Life had taught her resilience, and she wore it like armor. Though her world was far removed from the grandeur she served, Emily took pride in her work, finding small joys in simple things, an afternoon breeze through the laundry room window, or the occasional kind word from a colleague. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that their paths first truly crossed. Emily had been polishing the banister of the grand staircase when William, distracted by his phone, descended rapidly and nearly collided with her. She stepped back quickly, clutching her cleaning supplies. "Careful," William muttered, barely looking up, his tone clipped but not unkind. Emily, always polite, nodded. "Sorry, Mr. Carter." It could have ended there, just another brief interaction in a house where their worlds never truly intersected, but something about her caught William's attention. Maybe it was her quiet composure or the way her eyes held a kind of strength he wasn't used to seeing in the people around him. Whatever it was, he found himself pausing, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer than it should have. In the weeks that followed, William began noticing Emily more often. She wasn't like the other employees who scrambled to avoid his path or smothered him with deference. Emily was different, calm, capable, and entirely uninterested in his status. Perhaps that was what intrigued him most. For Emily, William was just another task in a long list of daily responsibilities, and she treated him as such. It started with casual remarks, a comment about the weather or an observation about the mansion's endless renovations. Slowly, those remarks turned into longer conversations, moments stolen in the quieter corners of the house. William, ever the charmer, had a way of making people feel seen, and Emily was no exception. For her part, Emily found herself drawn to the man behind the polished exterior, beneath his sharp wit and practiced charisma. There was a vulnerability, a hint of someone who might have been kinder in another life. Their connection deepened one evening, when Emily found herself alone in the library after finishing her duties. She often lingered there, drawn to the rows of books and the comforting silence they offered. William, returning late from a meeting, discovered her there, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp as she flipped through an old novel. "I didn't know you liked to read," he said, startling her. Emily looked up, startled. "Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," William said, stepping closer. "What are you reading?" She hesitated before showing him the cover. It was a classic, a story of love and redemption that seemed almost out of place in the grand library. "Good choice," he said with a small smile. "One of my favorites." From that night on, their interactions carried a different weight. What had begun as passing exchanges grew into something more. There was a spark between them, undeniable and intoxicating, though neither dared to name it. For William, it was a rare connection in a world where most people only wanted something from him. For Emily, it was a glimpse of a man who, despite his flaws, had the capacity for warmth. But the Carter mansion had eyes everywhere, and whispers spread faster than wildfire. To those who observed from the shadows, it was unthinkable. William Carter, the heir of New York's elite, entertaining even the faintest notion of affection for a housekeeper. And yet, it was happening. Neither of them could have foreseen how that spark would ignite a fire that would change their lives forever. Life at the Carter mansion resumed its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. Emily carried on with her duties, though she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in her relationship with William. Their stolen moments, once rare, became more frequent, and while they never spoke of anything too personal, an unspoken connection lingered between them. Emily knew better than to hope for more. William Carter belonged to a world so far removed from hers that even entertaining the idea felt foolish. Weeks turned into months, and their dynamic remained a well-kept secret. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of surfacing. Emily's quiet routine was shattered the day she discovered she was pregnant. She sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the positive test in disbelief. Her hands trembled as she tried to process the reality of what this meant, not just for her, but for her child. The father was William Carter, a man who barely knew her beyond their fleeting interactions, a man whose world would likely reject any claim she had to him. For a few days, Emily wrestled with her options. Should she tell him? Would he even believe her? The decision weighed heavily on her, but ultimately, she couldn't keep it to herself. William deserved to know, even if it meant facing rejection. Gathering her courage, Emily decided to approach him directly. She waited for a moment when he was alone, catching him one evening as he returned to the mansion from a late meeting. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. William turned, surprised to see her waiting at the entrance. "Emily, is everything all right? I need to talk to you," she said, glancing around nervously. It's important." William's brow furrowed as he nodded. "All right, let's talk." She led him to a quieter part of the garden, away from the prying eyes of staff. Emily took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she met his gaze. "I'm pregnant," she said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "And it's yours." For a moment, William simply stared at her, as if trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. Then, his expression shifted. Confusion, disbelief, and finally, frustration. "Emily," he said slowly, his tone sharper than she'd ever heard. This can't be true, are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure," she replied firmly, her eyes never leaving his. "I wouldn't come to you if I wasn't." William ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? Do you know what this could do to me? To my family?" "I'm not asking for anything," Emily said, her voice cracking under the weight of his reaction. "I just thought you deserved to know." His frustration boiled over. "Do you know how this looks, a Carter, tied to a—" He stopped himself, but the damage was done. Emily's face fell, her strength faltering as the meaning behind his words sank in. "Tied to a what? A nobody?" "That's not what I meant," William said quickly, though his hesitation betrayed him. "It's exactly what you meant," she shot back, her voice trembling with both anger and hurt. "You think I'm doing this for money, for attention. I thought better of you." William stopped pacing, his expression softening for the briefest moment. But before he could respond, the sound of distant footsteps reminded them they weren't truly alone. William sighed, his walls going back up. "I'll handle this," he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "Just don't say anything to anyone. Not yet." Emily nodded, tears brimming in her eyes as she turned and walked away, leaving William alone in the dimly lit garden. Over the next few weeks, Emily's life became even more challenging. The staff at the mansion began whispering, their knowing glances and hushed conversations growing louder by the day. Word of her pregnancy spread quickly, and with it came a flood of judgment. Some called her a gold digger. Others accused her of trying to trap William. Emily endured it all with quiet dignity, focusing on her work and her child, William. Meanwhile, struggled to maintain his composure. The rumors reached his family, and the backlash was immediate. His parents, particularly his mother, were livid at the mere suggestion of a Carter being connected to someone like Emily. Under pressure, William insisted on a DNA test to confirm the paternity, hoping to put the matter to rest. The day of the results was tense for both of them. Emily, despite her anger and disappointment in William, hoped that the truth would force him to take some responsibility. When the results came back, the confirmation was undeniable. William Carter was the father. "You're the father," Emily said when she confronted him with the results. Her voice was steady, though her heart ached at the coldness in his eyes. William sighed heavily, his pride and fear battling within him. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll acknowledge the child, but don't expect anything more." Emily stared at him, her hope crumbling into bitterness. "I don't need anything from you, William, but one day you'll regret this." As she walked away, Emily resolved to raise her child alone, determined to give Matthew a life filled with love and security, something William's world had clearly never offered her. The Carter mansion became a boiling pot of tension in the days following the DNA results. Emily returned to her modest apartment in Queens, her heart heavy with disappointment. Despite everything, she had hoped William would step up, not for her, but for the life growing inside her. His reaction, cold and dismissive, left no room for reconciliation. For William, the confirmation of his paternity was a blow to his carefully curated image. He spent nights in his private study, replaying the confrontation with Emily. The truth gnawed at him, but not for the reasons one might expect. It wasn't guilt over his actions or the prospect of being a father. It was fear. Fear of what his family, his peers, and the media would do if they got hold of this story. The first storm came from within the Carter family. Over dinner one evening, William's mother, Eleanor Carter, brought up the rumors circulating among the staff. "William," she said sharply, setting down her glass of wine, "I've been hearing some rather disturbing things. Something about a housekeeper and a child." William froze, his hand tightening around his fork. "Mother, it's being handled." "Handled?" Eleanor's voice rose, laced with icy disdain. "Do you understand what this could do to our family, to our reputation? We've worked too hard to be dragged through the mud because of your recklessness." "Enough, Mother," William snapped, his temper flaring. "I don't need a lecture." His father, Richard Carter, who rarely involved himself in family disputes, cleared his throat. "You may not like her methods, but your mother is right. This isn't just about you, William. It's about the Carters. Fix it. Fix it." The phrase echoed in William's mind long after the conversation ended. What did fixing it even mean? He couldn't undo the past, nor could he ignore the reality of the DNA test. And yet, the very thought of accepting responsibility filled him with dread. Meanwhile, Emily began to navigate her pregnancy alone. The whispers and stares from former colleagues weighed on her, but she refused to let them break her. She resigned from her job at the mansion, determined to create a life where neither she nor her child would be subject to the Carters' scorn. Her days were a mix of preparation and survival. She found part-time work as a waitress in a local diner, saving every penny she could for the baby. Her evenings were spent researching affordable childcare, prenatal classes, and anything else that might give her son a better future. Though exhausted, she felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Matthew. William, on the other hand, was in damage control mode. He arranged for a lawyer to draft an agreement, offering financial support to Emily in exchange for her silence. It was a move designed to placate his family while keeping his hands clean. He delivered the proposal himself. Arriving at Emily's apartment unannounced one evening, Emily opened the door, her expression neutral but her eyes wary. "William, what are you doing here?" "I came to make things right," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. He handed her the neatly bound document. "This outlines what I'm prepared to do. Financial support for the child. Regular payments. In return, I need you to agree to keep this private." Emily flipped through the pages, her jaw tightening as she read. When she looked up, her eyes burned with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You think money fixes this? That throwing some cash my way will make up for the fact that you want nothing to do with your own child?" "It's not like that," William began, but Emily cut him off. "Then what is it like, William? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like you trying to sweep this under the rug." William ran a hand through his hair, his frustration bubbling over. "You don't understand what it's like for me, Emily. The pressure, the expectations. I can't just..." "Can't what?" she interrupted. "Be a decent human being. Be a father. Her words struck a nerve, and for a moment, William said nothing. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of traffic outside. "I'm trying to do the right thing," he said finally, though even he didn't believe it. "No, you're trying to do the convenient thing," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "But I won't let you use my son to save face. He deserves better." With that, she handed the document back to him and shut the door. William stood there for a moment, stunned. Before turning and walking away, for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar: shame. As the months passed, Emily focused on building a future for herself and Matthew. She used what little savings she had to rent a small space in Queens and turned it into a cozy cafe offering homemade meals. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The local community quickly embraced her, drawn to the warmth of her personality and the simplicity of her food. Meanwhile, William's life remained a whirlwind of parties, deals, and the occasional headline in the tabloids. But the cracks were beginning to show. His reckless spending and poor investments were catching up to him, though he refused to acknowledge the growing storm. Two lives, once intertwined, now moved in opposite directions. Emily, fueled by determination, climbed steadily upward. William, blind to his own faults, teetered ever closer to the edge of ruin. Emily's life revolved around survival, but with Matthew growing inside her, survival took on a new meaning. Her mornings began before dawn, prepping her small cafe for the day. She'd spend hours perfecting her recipes, greeting customers with a warmth that masked the exhaustion in her bones. It wasn't just a business to her, it was her lifeline. Every plate she served, every smile she shared was a step toward the future she wanted for her child, a future free from the Carter family's shadow. By the time Matthew was born, the cafe had gained a modest reputation in Queens. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm. Regulars came for the food and stayed for Emily's kindness. She had built something meaningful, a foundation strong enough to support the life she was about to share with her son. Matthew entered the world on a crisp October morning. Emily held him close, his tiny fingers curling around hers, and promised herself she would give him the life he deserved. She named him Matthew because it meant gift from God. And to her, that's exactly what he was. The early months were a whirlwind of sleepless nights and endless worry. Balancing motherhood and running a cafe wasn't easy, but Emily adapted. She strapped Matthew to her chest while she worked in the kitchen, his soft coos blending with the chatter of customers. Her regulars adored him, often offering to hold him so she could catch her breath. Despite her struggles, Emily refused to ask for help from William. She didn't want his money, nor did she want the strings that came attached to it. She had seen enough of his world to know it wasn't a place where Matthew would thrive. Instead, she leaned on the small community she had built around her cafe. Her neighbors became her support system, offering her encouragement when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear. Meanwhile, William continued his life as if nothing had changed. He had agreed to the court-mandated financial support, but he kept his involvement with Emily and Matthew at a distance. His family made it clear that any acknowledgement of his connection to them was unacceptable. For William, it was easier to focus on his business, throwing himself into work as a way to avoid the uncomfortable truth of his actions. But cracks were beginning to form in his carefully constructed world. His company's recent ventures, fueled by risky investments, were starting to falter. Friends he once trusted were quietly backing away, and whispers of his financial instability began circulating in the upper echelons of New York society. William, however, refused to see the signs. He was a Carter. After all, failure wasn't an option. While William's empire teetered, Matthew flourished under Emily's care. By the time he turned 3, it was clear he was an exceptionally bright child. He had an insatiable curiosity, constantly asking questions about how things worked and why the world was the way it was. Emily nurtured his love for learning, spending her evenings reading to him and encouraging his natural abilities. "Why does the moon follow us?" Matthew asked one night as they walked home from the cafe. Emily smiled, holding his tiny hand in hers. "The moon isn't following us, sweetheart. It just looks that way because it's so far away. But it's always there, lighting up the night." Matthew looked up at her, his wide eyes filled with wonder. "Like you're always there for me." Her heart swelled at his words, and she knelt to meet his gaze. "Yes, just like that. I'll always be here for you, no matter what. Those moments were what kept Emily going. She saw pieces of William in Matthew, his sharp mind, his determination, but she hoped her son would grow up with a heart untouched by the arrogance and selfishness that had defined his father. By the time Matthew started school, Emily's cafe had grown into a community staple. She expanded her menu and hired a small team to help manage the growing business. It wasn't just a cafe anymore. It was a symbol of her resilience, a testament to what she could accomplish with hard work and love. William, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the weight of his choices. His company was hemorrhaging money, and the alliances he had once relied on were crumbling. He started avoiding high-profile events, embarrassed by the rumors surrounding his finances. For the first time in his life, he felt vulnerable. One evening, as he sat alone in his penthouse, he came across an article online about a small cafe in Queens. It praised the owner, Emily Johnson, for her dedication and for creating a space that felt like home. The accompanying photo showed Emily behind the counter, smiling warmly as she served a customer. Next to her, a small boy with strikingly familiar features peeked over the counter. William stared at the photo, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him: guilt, regret, and something he couldn't quite name. He had spent years ignoring the life he had created with Emily, convincing himself it wasn't his responsibility. But seeing Matthew's face, so full of life and potential, stirred something deep within him. For the first time, William wondered if he had made a mistake, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to be part of Matthew's world. Emily's cafe, now affectionately called Home Plate, had become a haven for the people of Queens. The warm glow of the storefront, the tantalizing smell of fresh bread wafting through the air, and Emily's welcoming smile were enough to draw in regulars and newcomers alike. For many, it wasn't just a place to eat. It was a place to feel seen, to belong. Emily poured her heart into every aspect of the business. The walls were adorned with framed photos of the cafe's journey, her opening day, the first team of staff she hired, and a few snapshots of Matthew as a toddler perched on the counter, though she had kept her struggles largely to herself. Those who frequented the cafe knew of her resilience. It was part of what made Home Plate so special. Matthew, now 6 years old, was a fixture in the cafe after school. He would sit in a corner booth, a stack of books by his side, while Emily worked. Customers loved him, often stopping to chat or quiz him on his growing knowledge. He had inherited his mother's warmth and determination, and his sharp intellect was becoming increasingly apparent. "Hey, Matt," called Mrs. Rivera, one of the cafe's regulars. "What are you reading today?" Matthew held up a book on astronomy, his eyes lighting up. "It's about the stars. Did you know some of them are already dead? But their light is still traveling to us," Mrs. Rivera chuckled. "You're going to be a genius one day, just like your mom." Matthew grinned proudly. "I want to be smart like her, but also, maybe I'll make something really big, like build my own rocket." Emily overheard the exchange as she cleared a nearby table, her heart swelling with pride. Despite everything, she had created a life for Matthew that was rich in love and opportunity. It wasn't the luxury he might have had with the Carters, but it was a life filled with meaning. Meanwhile, the cafe's reputation began to grow beyond the neighborhood. Word spread about the simple yet heartwarming meals, and soon Emily was catering for local events. A write-up in a small food blog brought in more business than she had ever anticipated. She was no longer just a single mother running a modest cafe. She was a businesswoman building an empire, one meal at a time. But with success came challenges. The long hours were grueling, and balancing work with raising Matthew wasn't always easy. Emily often found herself exhausted, yet she never let it show. Her customers and her son deserved the best she could give, and she refused to let them see her falter. One evening, as she locked up the cafe, Matthew tugged at her sleeve. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant, "why don't I have a dad like the other kids?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She knelt to meet his gaze, her hands gently resting on his shoulders. "You do have a dad, Matthew," she said softly, "but he's not here with us." "Why not?" Matthew pressed, his big, curious eyes searching hers. Emily hesitated, unsure of how much to tell him. "It's complicated," she said finally, "but what matters is that you have me, and I'll always be here for you." Matthew nodded, though she could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was too smart to be satisfied with half answers. But for now, he let it go. Emily, however, couldn't shake the weight of his question. She had always believed she was enough for Matthew. But was she? Was she wrong to keep him from knowing the truth about William? Unbeknownst to her, William was grappling with his own doubts. His once thriving business empire was now a shell of its former self. Failed investments and poor management had left him scrambling to salvage what little remained. The grandeur of his penthouse seemed emptier than ever, its opulence a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. William couldn't stop thinking about the photo he had seen of Emily and Matthew. The boy's face haunted him. A mirror of his own younger self, he had spent years convincing himself that staying away was the right thing to do, that his presence would only complicate their lives. But now, as his own world crumbled, he began to see things differently. One evening, after yet another failed attempt to secure funding for his company, William found himself scrolling through Emily's cafe's social media page. The posts were simple: photos of dishes, glowing customer reviews, and the occasional candid shot of Emily and Matthew working together. William felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years: regret. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out the window of his penthouse, the city lights sprawling below. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it might have been like to stay, to be there for Emily during her pregnancy, to watch Matthew grow up. The thought both comforted and tormented him. But what could he do now? He was a shadow of the man he once was, financially and emotionally. What could he possibly offer Emily or Matthew? And even if he tried, would they ever forgive him? As he drained his glass, a thought began to take shape. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still a chance to make things right. William Carter had built his empire on confidence, charm, and the ability to close deals with unshakable precision. Yet, over the past 2 years, that confidence had been eroding, chipped away by poor decisions and misplaced trust. His company, Carter Enterprises, once a titan in the world of luxury real estate, now stood on precarious ground. Investments that were supposed to yield millions instead drained his accounts. Partners he'd trusted for years turned their backs when the tide shifted. The signs had been there all along: warnings from his advisors, subtle shifts in the attitudes of colleagues. But William, ever the optimist, dismissed them. He had always been the golden boy, the Carter who could turn any loss into a win. He believed that luck, or perhaps sheer force of will, would pull him through. But luck was running out. One afternoon, as he sat in the conference room of his once bustling office, the silence was deafening. His assistant, normally a whirlwind of activity, had left early after yet another round of layoffs. The emptiness of the room mirrored the emptiness he felt inside. A report lay open before him, its numbers glaring in red ink, losses upon losses. The realization hit him like a freight train. He was losing everything. That night, William attended a fundraiser hosted by an old associate. It was one of the few remaining invitations he could still secure, a reminder of the diminishing social capital he once wielded effortlessly. The ballroom was filled with familiar faces, but the conversations carried a different tone. Where there had once been deference and admiration, there was now thinly veiled pity. "William," an older man said, clapping him on the back, "how are things over at Carter Enterprises? Haven't heard much from you lately." William forced a smile. "We're in the middle of some restructuring," he said smoothly. "Big changes coming soon." The man nodded, but the skepticism in his eyes was unmistakable. William excused himself, heading for the bar. As he sipped his drink, he overheard snippets of conversation. His name, his company, his downfall. The whispers followed him everywhere he went, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. As the night wore on, William found himself thinking about Emily and Matthew. He had spent years justifying his absence, telling himself that staying away was better for them. But now, as he faced the possibility of losing everything, he couldn't shake the image of Matthew's face from the cafe photo. The boy deserved more than a monthly check and a father who lived in the shadows. The following morning, William sat in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline. His pride, once an unassailable fortress, had been thoroughly dismantled. He thought about his father, Richard Carter, a man who had instilled in him the belief that strength was measured by power and wealth. But what good were power and wealth if they left him empty and alone? As he pored over financial reports, a headline caught his eye. Queen's Cafe wins award for community impact. The accompanying photo showed Emily holding a plaque, her smile radiant. Beside her stood Matthew, clutching a small trophy of his own. The caption read, "Matthew Johnson, age 6, wins regional math competition." William's chest tightened. The article praised Emily's success, highlighting her journey from humble beginnings to becoming a respected business owner. It described the cafe as a cornerstone of the community, a place where customers felt like family. But what struck William most was the way it spoke of Matthew, not just as a bright child, but as a reflection of Emily's unwavering determination and love. Matthew Johnson, he murmured to himself, the name feeling foreign yet familiar on his tongue. He hadn't even been consulted about the boy's name, a detail that stung more than he cared to admit. The pang of guilt grew stronger as he read the article again. He had stayed away out of pride, out of fear of complicating their lives. But had his absence made things better? Or had it only hurt them more? For Emily, the day William's name resurfaced in her life was just like any other. She had opened the cafe early, as usual, and was busy preparing for the lunch rush when the door chimed. Glancing up, she froze. William stood there, looking out of place in his tailored suit amid the warm, homey atmosphere of home plate. "William," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and caution. "What are you doing here?" He hesitated, his confidence faltering under her steady gaze. "I wanted to talk. About everything." Emily set down the tray she was carrying and crossed her arms. "Everything. That's a lot to cover, don't you think?" William managed a weak smile. "I suppose it is. But I'd like to start somewhere." Emily sighed, gesturing toward an empty table. "Fine, sit. But make it quick. I have work to do." As William sat, he couldn't help but notice the small details of the cafe, the handwritten menu on the chalkboard, the framed photos on the walls, the hum of friendly chatter. It was a world so different from his own. Yet it felt whole, complete. "I saw the article about the cafe," he began. "And about Matthew." Emily raised an eyebrow. "So you came here out of curiosity or guilt?" "Both," he admitted. "I've made mistakes, Emily, I know that. But I want to be part of his life if you'll let me." Emily's expression hardened. "You think you can just walk in here and ask for that? After all these years, Matthew doesn't even know you." "I know," William said, his voice soft. "And I don't expect this to be easy, but I'm willing to try. I want to make things right. For him, and for you." Emily studied him for a long moment, her emotions warring within her. She had waited years for an apology, for some acknowledgement of what he had done. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure what to do with it. "You don't get to decide when you're ready, William," she said finally. "This isn't about you. It's about Matthew. And if you really want to make things right, you'll have to prove it." William nodded, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. "I will," he promised. "I'll prove it." For the first time in years, William felt like he had a purpose, something worth fighting for. But earning Emily's trust and Matthew's love would take more than words. It would take actions, the kind that couldn't be undone. Matthew Johnson had always been a curious child. From the moment he could speak, his questions had kept Emily on her toes. Why does the sun go to bed? How do birds fly? What makes the sky change colors? By the time he was 6, these questions had evolved into more intricate ones about numbers, patterns, and how things worked. Emily marveled at his brilliance, though she sometimes wondered where his insatiable curiosity came from. William's absence made it easy to forget that Matthew had inherited more than just his father's striking features. He also had his sharp mind at school. Matthew's teachers noticed his exceptional abilities early on, while other children struggled with basic arithmetic. Matthew was solving problems far beyond his grade level. His teacher, Mrs. Rivera, sent a note home one afternoon requesting a meeting with Emily when Emily arrived at the small classroom. She was met by a smiling Miss Rivera, who motioned for her to sit. "Mrs. Johnson," Miss Rivera began. "Matthew is a remarkable child. His aptitude for math and problem-solving is unlike anything I've seen at his age." Emily beamed with pride. "He does love numbers. He's always asking me about patterns and how things work." Miss Rivera leaned forward. "I think he would benefit from participating in the regional math competition. It's a wonderful opportunity for bright students to challenge themselves, and I truly believe Matthew has what it takes to win." Emily hesitated. While she wanted to support Matthew in every way, the idea of putting him in the spotlight made her uneasy. She thought of the whispers and judgment she had endured when Matthew was a baby, the stares of people who dismissed her as the Carter housekeeper with a child out of wedlock. "I don't know," she said cautiously. "Matthew is sensitive about certain things. He's still so young." "Mrs. Rivera smiled gently. "I understand your concern, but I've seen him in class, Emily. He's confident, thoughtful, and resilient. He has a gift, and I think it would do him good to see just how far that gift can take him." Later that evening, Emily brought it up with Matthew over dinner at the cafe. "Your teacher thinks you should enter a math competition," she said, watching his face for a reaction. Matthew's eyes lit up. "A competition? Like a game?" "Sort of," Emily said with a smile. "You'd solve problems, and if you do really well, you could win a prize." Matthew clapped his hands together, excitement bubbling over. "Can I do it, Mom? Please." Emily couldn't help but laugh at his enthusiasm. "All right," she said, ruffling his hair. "But you have to promise me one thing. You'll have fun no matter what." The weeks leading up to the competition were filled with preparation. Matthew spent hours working on practice problems. While Emily did her best to support him, she stayed up late researching math concepts she didn't fully understand, just so she could help him study. Despite the long days at the cafe, she found joy in watching Matthew thrive. The day of the competition arrived, and Emily dressed Matthew in his best outfit, a crisp white shirt and a pair of neatly pressed khakis. As they walked into the auditorium, Matthew's excitement turned to nervousness. He clung to Emily's hand, his big brown eyes scanning the crowd of other children and their parents. "Mom," he whispered, "what if I'm not smart enough?" Emily knelt to his level, holding his face in her hands. "Matthew, you're one of the smartest kids I've ever met, but this isn't about being the best. It's about trying your best. And no matter what happens, I'll be proud of you." Matthew nodded, his confidence bolstered by her words. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. The competition was intense, with round after round of increasingly difficult problems. Parents watched from the audience as their children scribbled furiously on their worksheets, the tension in the room palpable. Emily's heart swelled with pride as she watched Matthew tackle each challenge with focus and determination. When the final round ended, the judges called the participants to the stage. Emily held her breath as the announcer began reading the results. "In third place," the announcer said, pausing for dramatic effect. Matthew fidgeted nervously, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "And in first place," the announcer continued, "with a near-perfect score, Matthew Johnson." The auditorium erupted in applause as Matthew's face lit up with pure joy. He turned to Emily, his smile wide enough to light up the entire room. She clapped furiously, tears streaming down her face as she watched him accept his trophy. That evening, back at the cafe, a group of regulars gathered to celebrate Matthew's victory. They decorated the place with balloons and a homemade "congratulations." "Matthew?" banner. The little boy basked in the attention, proudly showing off his trophy to anyone who would listen. As the party wound down, Emily sat with Matthew in their favorite corner booth. He was still clutching his trophy, his eyelids heavy with sleep. "Mom," he murmured, his voice soft. "Do you think my dad would be proud of me?" The question caught Emily off guard. She hesitated, stroking his hair as she thought of how to respond. "I think anyone who knows you would be proud of you, Matthew," she said finally. "You're an amazing boy." Matthew yawned, his eyes drifting shut. Emily watched him sleep, her heart heavy with the weight of his question. For all of William's flaws, she knew he would have been proud of Matthew if he'd been there to see him shine. But William wasn't there, and as much as Emily tried to protect Matthew from that reality, she knew it was only a matter of time before he started asking harder questions. The Carter name had always opened doors for William, but now it seemed to be closing them. The once unshakable foundation of Carter Enterprises was crumbling, and with it, the life William had so carefully built. Lavish parties turned into quiet evenings in his penthouse, where the silence was louder than any gala he'd ever attended. The deals that had once been sealed with a handshake now required desperate negotiations, and even those often fell through. One afternoon, William sat in the boardroom of Carter Enterprises, staring at a group of investors who looked more like vultures than allies. His CFO was presenting yet another grim financial report, the words blurring together in William's mind. Losses, decline, bankruptcy. "Mr. Carter," one of the investors interrupted. "You've been promising a turnaround for months, yet here we are. When will you accept that the ship is sinking?" William clenched his jaw, refusing to let his frustration show. "The ship isn't sinking," he replied firmly. "We're restructuring. These things take time." The investor scoffed. "Time is money, and you're out of both." After the meeting adjourned, William remained in the empty boardroom, his hands gripping the edge of the table for the first time in his life. He felt powerless. His name, his reputation, his charm, none of it seemed to matter anymore. Later that evening, as he returned to his penthouse, the weight of his failures pressed down on him. The space, once a symbol of his success, now felt hollow. The walls adorned with expensive art seemed to mock him. He poured himself a drink and sank into the leather armchair by the window, staring at the glittering skyline of Manhattan. It felt farther away than ever. Amid his spiraling thoughts, his mind wandered to Emily and Matthew. He hadn't stopped thinking about the photo from the cafe's article, the way Matthew had smiled as he held his trophy. William had no idea what the competition was for, but the pride on the boy's face was unmistakable. It was a look William had rarely seen in his own reflection. "Matthew," he said softly to himself, the name foreign yet familiar. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, his thoughts racing. He had spent years justifying his absence, telling himself that he was doing the right thing by staying away. But now, as his empire crumbled, he wondered if that had been a lie. He'd told himself to avoid guilt. Meanwhile, at home plate, Emily was wrapping up for the evening. The cafe had been busier than usual since Matthew's competition win. Word of the little math prodigy had spread through the neighborhood, and regulars stopped by to congratulate Emily and dote on Matthew. As Emily wiped down the counter, Matthew sat at a table nearby, working through a book of math puzzles. He had been glued to it ever since Mrs. Rivera gifted it to him after the competition. "You know," Emily said, glancing over at him, "you're allowed to take a break sometimes." Matthew looked up with a sheepish grin. "But it's fun, Mom. Look, I figured out how to solve this one faster than the example." Emily chuckled, shaking her head. "You're incredible, you know that." Matthew beamed, but his expression turned thoughtful. "Mom, do you think my dad's good at math too?" The question caught Emily off guard. She placed the cloth she was holding on the counter and sat across from him. "Why do you ask that?" "Ms. Rivera said I must have gotten my math skills from somewhere," he replied. "I know you're good at cooking and running the cafe, but maybe my dad's good at numbers too." Emily hesitated. She had spent so much time shielding Matthew from questions about William that she hadn't prepared for moments like this. "Your dad, he's good at a lot of things," she said carefully. "He's very smart. You probably did get some of your talents from him." Matthew's eyes lit up. "Really? Do you think he'd want to solve puzzles with me?" Emily felt a pang in her chest. How could she answer that without breaking his heart? "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I know he'd be proud of how smart you are." Matthew nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. But as he returned to his book, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time. Matthew was getting older, and his questions were becoming harder to deflect. Sooner or later, she would have to decide how much of the truth to share that night, as William sat in his penthouse. The silence became unbearable. He grabbed his coat and headed out, his driver pulling up moments later. For the first time in years, he asked to be taken to Queens. The drive felt longer than it should have, as if the distance between his world and Emily's was more than just miles. When they arrived at home plate, William hesitated before stepping out of the car. The cafe was closed for the night, but the warm glow of the sign in the window still shone brightly. He stared at the little cafe, a stark contrast to the towering skyscrapers he was used to. It was small, unassuming, yet it felt alive in a way his world hadn't in years. He could see faint silhouettes inside, Emily cleaning up, and Matthew flipping through his book. For a moment, he considered knocking on the door, but fear held him back. What could he possibly say? How could he explain years of absence and indifference? And what if Emily refused to let him in? Before he could answer his own questions, he turned and got back into the car. As they drove away, he couldn't help but glance back at the cafe, the warmth of its light fading into the distance. For the first time in years, William felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: longing. It was an unusually busy afternoon at Home Plate. The cafe was abuzz with chatter, the aroma of fresh bread and simmering soups filling the air. Emily moved gracefully between tables, balancing plates and refilling coffee cups, her practiced smile never faltering. Matthew, perched at his usual corner booth, worked on his newest book of puzzles, occasionally pausing to share his solutions with a friendly regular. Emily was in the middle of taking an order when the bell above the door chimed, signaling a new customer. She glanced up with her customary greeting ready, but froze when she saw who had entered: William Carter. He stood in the doorway, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the cozy, modest surroundings of the cafe. His presence drew a few curious stares, but Emily barely noticed. Her heart raced as she set the notepad down, signaling one of her staff to take over. She approached William cautiously, her emotions swirling: anger, confusion, and a flicker of something she didn't want to name. "William," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "What are you doing here?" He cleared his throat, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "I came to talk." "Talk." Emily crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "About what?" "Everything," he said quietly, his gaze shifting to the floor before meeting hers again. "About Matthew. About us." Emily glanced over her shoulder where Matthew was still engrossed in his book, unaware of the tension now hanging in the air. "Not here," she said firmly, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the cafe. "Follow me." They sat at a small table away from the main dining area. Emily leaned back, arms crossed, her eyes locked on William. He shifted uncomfortably, unaccustomed to the vulnerability he felt under her scrutiny. "I saw the article about the cafe," he began, his voice softer than she remembered. "And about Matthew." Emily's heart clenched, but she refused to let it show. "And what does that have to do with you?" William exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I know I've been absent. More than absent. Really, I've made mistakes, Emily, I know that. But seeing that article, seeing Matthew..." He trailed off, his words failing him. Emily leaned forward, her tone sharper than she intended. "You think one article changes anything? You think you can just show up here after years of ignoring us and expect me to listen?" "I don't expect anything," William said quickly, his voice tinged with desperation. I want to try, to be there for him, to make things right." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "You want to make things right, William. You've missed 6 years of his life. 6 years. Do you have any idea how hard it's been? Raising him on my own? How much he's asked about you?" "I know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one anyway." Before Emily could respond, a small voice interrupted them. "Mom, who's this?" Emily turned to see Matthew standing a few feet away, clutching his book of puzzles. His curious gaze shifted between his mother and the stranger sitting across from her. Emily's heart sank. She had dreaded this moment for years, and now it was here. "Matthew," she said gently, kneeling to meet his gaze. This is your father." Matthew's eyes widened as he looked at William, his small hands tightening around the book. "My dad?" he asked, his voice filled with both wonder and confusion. William stood slowly, his usual composure completely gone. He looked at the boy, his son, and felt a lump form in his throat. "Hi, Matthew," he said softly. It's really nice to meet you." Matthew stared at him for a long moment before turning back to Emily. "Why didn't I know him before?" Emily hesitated, her chest tightening. "It's complicated, sweetheart. But he's here now because he wants to get to know you." Matthew's gaze returned to William, studying him with an intensity that reminded Emily so much of her son's analytical mind. Finally, Matthew spoke. "Do you like puzzles?" The question caught both adults off guard. William blinked before nodding. "I do, actually. I used to love solving them when I was younger." Matthew seemed to consider this before handing William the book he'd been carrying. "This one's tricky," he said. "Can you figure it out?" William took the book, his hands trembling slightly. He scanned the page and smiled faintly. "This is a tough one," he admitted, "but I think I can solve it." Emily watched, her emotions warring within her as William sat with Matthew, the two of them poring over the puzzle together. It was a small moment, but it was more than she had ever thought she'd see. When the cafe closed for the evening, Emily and William stood outside as Matthew played nearby, his laughter echoing in the crisp night air. "You can't just drop in and expect everything to be okay," Emily said, her tone softer than before. "It's not just about showing up. You have to prove you're here for him, for good." William nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, and I will. Whatever it takes, I'll prove it." Emily didn't respond right away. She wasn't ready to trust him yet, but as she watched William laugh with Matthew, she allowed herself to hope, for the first time, that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The days following William's unannounced visit to the cafe were a whirlwind of emotion for Emily. Her carefully constructed life had been disrupted, and she wasn't sure if letting William back in was the right decision. She couldn't deny the glimmer of hope she'd seen in Matthew's eyes when he realized his father was there. But hope wasn't enough to erase years of absence for William. The visit had been a turning point. Seeing Matthew, hearing him speak, and witnessing his brilliance firsthand had ignited something deep within him, a determination to make amends, no matter how difficult. But rebuilding bridges burned by years of neglect would not be easy, and he knew Emily would make sure of that a few days later. William stood outside the cafe again, this time holding a small wrapped package. The early morning air was brisk, and the sounds of the city waking up provided a soothing backdrop to his nervous thoughts. He hesitated before entering, unsure of how Emily would react to his return. The door's bell chimed softly as he stepped inside. Emily, arranging pastries in the display case, looked up and froze. Her eyes narrowed as she wiped her hands on her apron. "You're back," she said, her tone neutral but guarded. "I am," William replied, holding up the package. "I brought something for Matthew." Emily crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "And what is that supposed to do? Buy his forgiveness?" William winced. "It's not about buying anything. It's a chess set. I read that he's interested in puzzles and strategy games. I thought we could play together." Emily sighed, leaning against the counter. "You can't just waltz in here and fix things with gifts." "William, he needs more than that." "I know," he said earnestly. "I'm not here to fix anything with a chessboard. I just want to spend time with him. To start somewhere, please." Before Emily could respond, Matthew appeared from the back room, a backpack slung over his shoulder. His eyes lit up when he saw William. "Hey!" Matthew exclaimed, running over. "You came back." William crouched to meet him, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "I did, and I brought you something." He handed Matthew the package, watching nervously as the boy tore into it. Matthew's face lit up when he saw the chess set. "Cool. I've always wanted to learn how to play this." "Well," William said, "how about I teach you?" Matthew turned to Emily, his excitement palpable. "Can I, Mom? Please?" Emily hesitated, glancing between Matthew's hopeful face and William's pleading eyes. She sighed, relenting. "Fine, but only for a little while. I have work to do, and so do you." The next hour passed in a blur of laughter and concentration. William showed Matthew the basics of the game, how the pieces moved, simple strategies to think ahead. To his delight, Matthew picked it up quickly, his analytical mind thriving on the challenge. "You're really good at this," William said, genuinely impressed. "I bet you'll beat me in no time." Matthew grinned. "Maybe, but I'll let you win sometimes. Since you're just learning again." Emily observed them from behind the counter, her heart conflicted. It was strange seeing William in this light, a patient, attentive father who seemed genuinely invested in their son. She wanted to believe he had changed, but the scars of his past actions ran deep. As the cafe grew busier, Emily called Matthew over to help her. "It's time to get to work, kiddo," she said, ruffling his hair. Matthew groaned but obeyed, leaving the chess set neatly arranged on the table. William stood, slipping his coat back on. "I should get going," he said, glancing at Emily. "Thank you for letting me spend time with him." Emily nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "We'll see if you keep showing up." "I will," William promised. "You'll see." Over the next few weeks, William made good on his promise. He began visiting the cafe regularly, always with a new idea or activity to share with Matthew. They played chess, worked on puzzles, and even started building a small model rocket together. Matthew's excitement was infectious, and Emily couldn't help but notice how much brighter her son seemed with his father around. But it wasn't just Matthew who noticed the change. The cafe regulars, who had come to see themselves as part of Emily and Matthew's extended family, began to warm to William as well. At first, they were wary, protective of Emily, and skeptical of William's intentions. But as they watched him interact with Matthew, their opinions began to shift. "Seems like he's trying," Mrs. Rivera said one afternoon, sipping her coffee as she watched William help Matthew with a particularly tricky puzzle. Emily sighed, wiping down the counter. "He's trying now, but where was he all those years when we needed him?" Mrs. Rivera patted her hand. "People change, querida. Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what matters most." Emily nodded, but remained silent. She wasn't ready to forgive William. Not yet, but she couldn't deny that Matthew's happiness was worth the risk. One evening, as they closed the cafe, Matthew turned to Emily. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant, "do you think Dad will come tomorrow?" Emily knelt in front of him, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "I think he will," she said softly. "He's been showing up, hasn't he?" Matthew nodded, his eyes bright. "I like having him around. He's fun and smart. Like you said." Emily's chest tightened. She had fought so hard to protect Matthew from disappointment, but now she wondered if she was holding on to her own fears at the expense of her son's happiness. As Matthew headed off to bed, Emily stood in the quiet of the cafe, her thoughts swirling. Maybe it was time to let the past loosen its grip. Maybe William really had changed, but she wouldn't make it easy for him. If William wanted to be part of their lives, he would have to prove that his commitment was real. Every single day. For Matthew, having William around was like uncovering a hidden part of his life he hadn't known he was missing. The once distant figure he had imagined as his father was now sitting across from him at the cafe, teaching him chess moves and building rockets out of cardboard. But for Emily, the situation was more complicated. The memories of William's abandonment were fresh, and though she saw the effort he was making, trust was not easily rebuilt. One crisp Saturday morning, William arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, carrying a box filled with what looked like old books. Emily raised an eyebrow as he placed it on the counter. "What's this?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Some of my old math books," William explained, a nervous edge to his voice. "I thought Matthew might enjoy them. He's a lot like me when I was his age. Curious, always wanting to learn." Emily's eyes softened for a moment, but she quickly masked it with a neutral expression. "That's thoughtful, but don't think you can win him over with gifts alone." William nodded, his expression earnest. "I know. I'm not trying to buy his affection, Emily. I want him to have what I didn't. Someone to encourage him." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she sighed. "We'll see." As the days passed, Matthew's attachment to William grew. They spent hours poring over the books William had brought, solving problems and working through challenges together. Matthew's enthusiasm was infectious, and William found himself genuinely enjoying their time. One evening, as they sat in a corner of the cafe, Matthew asked a question that caught William off guard. "Dad," he began, the word still new and tentative on his tongue. "Why weren't you around before?" The question hung in the air like a weight, and Emily, who had been cleaning tables nearby, froze. William set down the pencil he was holding, his expression troubled. "I wasn't ready," he admitted after a long pause. "I made mistakes, Matthew. Big ones. And because of that, I missed out on a lot of things. On you." Matthew frowned, his young mind trying to process the explanation. "But you're here now, right?" William nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Matthew's face brightened at the reassurance, but Emily's expression remained unreadable. She knew William's words were sincere, but sincerity alone wasn't enough. He had to prove his commitment with actions, not just promises. Despite his growing bond with Matthew, William struggled to reconcile his presence in their lives with his own failures. The mounting pressure from his failing business only added to his internal conflict. Carter Enterprises was now little more than a name, and William's financial woes were becoming harder to conceal. One afternoon, while helping Matthew with a particularly challenging math problem, William's phone buzzed. It was a call from his lawyer. He stepped outside to take it, leaving Matthew puzzled by his abrupt departure. "How bad is it?" William asked, his voice low. "Bad?" the lawyer replied. "The investors are losing patience, and your assets are dwindling. If you don't find a solution soon, bankruptcy is inevitable." William pinched the bridge of his nose, the weight of his predicament pressing down on him. "I'll figure something out," he said, though the words felt hollow. When he returned to the cafe, Matthew looked up at him with concern. "Is everything okay?" William forced a smile. "Just work stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." But Emily, who had overheard part of the conversation, wasn't convinced. She pulled William aside later, her expression serious. "Is something going on?" she asked. William hesitated before nodding. "The company's in trouble. Big trouble. I'm trying to fix it, but it's complicated." Emily crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Does this mean you're going to disappear again? Because if it does, you'd better tell him now instead of letting him get his hopes up." William's jaw tightened. "I'm not going anywhere, Emily. No matter what happens with the company, I'm here for Matthew." She studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "You'd better mean that," she said quietly, "because if you hurt him again, I won't forgive you." Over the following weeks, the tension between William's crumbling business and his efforts to reconnect with Matthew reached a boiling point. He began spending more time at the cafe, not just to see Matthew, but also to find solace in the warm, welcoming atmosphere. For the first time in years, William felt like he belonged somewhere, not because of his wealth or status, but because of the people who accepted him for who he was trying to become. One evening, after closing the cafe, Emily found William sitting alone at one of the tables, staring at a chessboard. "Long day?" she asked, pulling up a chair. He nodded, a weary smile crossing his face. "You could say that." Emily hesitated before speaking again. "Matthew really looks up to you. He talks about you all the time now. It's strange, but it's good for him." William looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "That means a lot, Emily. I know I've messed up, but I'm trying, for him. And maybe, for you too." Emily's cheeks flushed, and she quickly looked away. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice firm, but not unkind. "It's about Matthew. If you're serious about staying, prove it. Not just to him, but to me." "I will," William said, his voice steady. "I promise." Emily nodded, though her expression remained cautious. Trust, she knew, would take time, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope that William might truly be here to stay. The hum of the cafe was a comforting background as William sat at the corner table with Matthew. A small, half-finished model rocket lay between them, its tiny pieces scattered like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Matthew's brow furrowed as he carefully applied glue to one of the fins, his concentration so intense it made William chuckle. "You've got steady hands," William said. "I could have used you in some of my projects." Matthew looked up, his face lighting up with pride. "You had projects like this?" "Not exactly," William replied, leaning back in his chair. "More like business projects. Numbers. Plans. Building ideas from scratch. But in a way, it's kind of the same thing. You start with a bunch of pieces and figure out how to make them work together." "That sounds cool," Matthew said, his curiosity piqued. "Can you teach me that stuff too?" The question caught William off guard for a moment. He couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the simple sincerity of Matthew's request. "Of course," he said finally. "I'd love to." From behind the counter, Emily watched them with a mix of emotions. Seeing William and Matthew bond stirred something deep within her, a flicker of hope, tempered by caution. William was trying. She had to admit that. He showed up every day, engaging with Matthew in ways she hadn't expected, but the fear of him leaving again lingered, a shadow she couldn't shake. "Mom?" Matthew called, waving her over. "Look at our rocket." Emily smiled as she approached their table. The rocket, though small and still unfinished, was clearly a labor of love. "It looks great," she said, ruffling Matthew's hair. "You two make a good team." Matthew beamed, and William gave her a small, almost shy smile. "He's a quick learner," William said. "Must get that from you." Emily raised an eyebrow but chose not to respond. Instead, she turned her attention to the rocket. "When's the launch?" "Tomorrow," Matthew exclaimed, Dad said we can do it at the park after school." The word dad hung in the air, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. Matthew had started using it casually, as though it had always been part of his vocabulary. For him, it seemed natural. For Emily, it was a reminder of how much she was risking by letting William back into their lives. The next afternoon, the trio gathered at a nearby park. The rocket, now fully assembled and painted with Matthew's chosen colors of blue and silver, stood proudly on its makeshift launch pad. A small group of curious onlookers had gathered, their excitement palpable. "Ready?" William asked, handing Matthew the control switch. Matthew nodded eagerly, his hands gripping the small device. "Countdown," he shouted. 3, 2, 1, they said in unison. Matthew pressed the button, and the rocket shot into the sky, leaving a thin trail of smoke behind. Cheers erupted from the crowd as it reached its peak and deployed a tiny parachute, drifting gracefully back to the ground. "That was awesome," Matthew exclaimed, running to retrieve the rocket. William laughed, clapping a hand on his son's shoulder when he returned. "You did great, kid." Emily, standing a few feet away, couldn't help but smile at their shared joy. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine a future where scenes like this were commonplace. A future where William truly became the father Matthew deserved. Later that evening, back at the cafe. William sat with Emily after Matthew had gone to bed. The cafe was quiet now, the warm glow of the lights casting a serene atmosphere. "Thank you," William said, breaking the silence. "For what?" Emily asked, her tone cautious. "For letting me be here," he said. "For giving me a chance. I know I don't deserve it, but it means everything to me." Emily studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You're doing well with Matthew," she admitted. "He adores you, but this isn't just about showing up for the fun stuff. Being a father means being there when it's hard too." "I know," William said, his voice steady. "And I'm not going anywhere. I've made too many mistakes to risk making another one." Emily nodded, though the doubt in her heart remained. "I hope that's true," she said quietly. For his sake, William leaned forward, his gaze earnest. "I mean it, Emily. I've spent years focused on the wrong things. Money, power, appearances, but none of it matters if I can't be there for Matthew or for you." The words hung in the air, and Emily's heart raced. She wanted to believe him, but trusting William again felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm. One misstep, and everything she'd built could come crashing down. "I don't need you to be here for me," she said finally. "Just for Matthew." William nodded, though the look in his eyes suggested otherwise. He wanted to be there for both of them, to rebuild not just his relationship with Matthew, but the trust he had broken with Emily. But he knew better than to push. Trust, he realized, would have to be earned one day at a time. As the weeks passed, William continued to show up. Not just for Matthew, but for the hard moments, too. He helped with homework, attended school meetings, and even stayed late at the cafe to wash dishes when Emily was short-staffed. Slowly but surely, the walls Emily had built around her heart began to crack. One evening, as they closed the cafe together, Emily turned to William. "You've been consistent," she said, her tone soft but cautious. "That's a start." William smiled, sensing the faintest glimmer of hope in her words. "It's more than a start," he said. "It's a promise." For the first time, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, William could keep it. The days rolled into weeks, and William continued to show up, chipping away at the mistrust Emily held tightly. His bond with Matthew deepened, their time together filled with chess games, homework sessions, and long talks about numbers and the stars. Matthew's excitement each time William arrived at the cafe was undeniable, and Emily couldn't ignore how much her son thrived with his father in his life. But for Emily, the doubts lingered late one evening after the cafe had closed. Emily found herself sitting at the counter, staring at the pile of receipts she needed to reconcile. Her thoughts, however, were elsewhere, on William, his promises, and the quiet fear that he might one day vanish as quickly as he had reappeared. Her best friend Laura, who worked part-time at the cafe, walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She noticed Emily's pensive expression and leaned against the counter. "You've been quiet tonight," Laura said. "What's on your mind?" Emily sighed, setting down the receipts. "It's William. He's been good with Matthew, better than I ever expected. But I keep wondering when the other shoe is going to drop. Laura raised an eyebrow. You think he's going to leave again? I don't know, Emily admitted. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just waiting for something to go wrong because that's what I've always done. I've had to be ready for the worst. And now, I don't know how to let myself trust him. Laura nodded thoughtfully. You've been doing this on your own for so long, Em. It's hard to let someone back in after they've hurt you, especially someone like him. But have you thought about what it means for Matthew? He deserves to have a father who's trying. Emily looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter. I know he does. That's why I'm giving William a chance. But what if he lets Matthew down again? I don't know if either of us could handle that. Laura placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. You're protecting yourself and Matthew, and that's good. But maybe this time, William really means it. People can change, and from what I've seen, he's trying. Meanwhile, William was grappling with his own fears, though he had found a rhythm with Matthew. The looming shadow of his failing business weighed heavily on him. Every day brought a new crisis. Angry investors, dwindling funds, and the constant threat of bankruptcy. But for the first time in his life, William's priorities had shifted. He didn't care about the boardroom battles as much as he cared about showing up for his son. One evening, as he sat in his dimly lit penthouse, a stack of overdue bills spread across the table. William stared at the framed photo he had recently taken with Matthew at the park. The boy's wide grin and shining eyes were a reminder of what truly mattered, but the fear of losing everything still loomed large. The next morning, William arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, carrying a paper bag of pastries. Emily raised an eyebrow as he entered. Trying to bribe me with breakfast now, she teased, though her tone was light. Figured I'd give you a break from cooking for once, William replied, setting the bag on the counter. How are things here? Busy, Emily said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. But good. Matthew's been asking about you nonstop. William's face softened. He's incredible, Emily. You've done an amazing job with him. Emily glanced at him, surprised by the genuine admiration in his voice. Thanks, but he's his own person. I've just tried to give him the tools to be the best version of himself. You've done more than that, William said. You've built this whole world for him, a world I wasn't part of. And now that I am, I'm starting to see just how much I've missed. Emily hesitated, her walls threatening to crack. She wanted to believe his words, but the years of disappointment had left scars. Words are easy, William, she said softly. It's your actions that matter. That afternoon, Matthew ran into the cafe after school, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. He spotted William immediately and darted over to him. Dad, he exclaimed, pulling out a piece of paper. Look what I got. William took the paper, his eyes widening as he read. A perfect score on your math test. That's amazing, Matthew. Emily watched the exchange from the counter, her heart aching in the best way. Seeing Matthew light up around William was a reminder of what her son had been missing, and what he could have if William stayed. Dad, Matthew said, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial tone. Can we do something special this weekend? Just the three of us? William glanced at Emily, his expression hopeful. What do you think up for a family day? Emily hesitated. The word family felt heavy, like a promise she wasn't sure they were ready to make. But when she saw the excitement in Matthew's eyes, she couldn't say no. All right, she said finally. But don't think this means I'm letting you off the hook, William. He grinned, relief washing over him. I wouldn't dream of it. That weekend, they ventured to a nearby museum, where Matthew marveled at the interactive exhibits and quizzed William on every fact he could find. Emily trailed behind them, her heart warming at the sight of their bond. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope, a small tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, William had changed. But as they left the museum, her doubts crept back in. Trusting William wasn't just about their history. It was about their future. And while he was showing promise, Emily knew that keeping her guard up was the only way to protect Matthew, and herself, from potential heartbreak. That night, as she tucked Matthew into bed, he looked up at her with sleepy eyes. Mom, he said, his voice soft. I think Dad really likes being here. Do you think he'll stay forever? Emily kissed his forehead, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. "I hope so, sweetheart," she said quietly. "I really hope so." But as she left his room, Emily knew that hope alone wouldn't be enough. William had to prove that his promises weren't fleeting, that he was truly ready to be the father and partner they both deserved. The small cafe buzzed with its usual hum of activity, regulars laughing over steaming mugs of coffee while Emily navigated the space with practiced ease. It was a typical Saturday morning, but something about the atmosphere felt lighter. For the past few weeks, William's presence had become a regular fixture, and even the once skeptical cafe regulars were beginning to soften toward him. At one of the corner tables, Matthew sat with William, their heads bent over yet another chess match. Emily stole a glance at them from behind the counter, a mix of emotions stirring in her chest. She had fought so hard to build this life for herself and Matthew, and now, watching them together, she wondered if perhaps William could be a part of it after all. "Checkmate," Matthew declared triumphantly, his grin wide. William leaned back, chuckling. "You've been hustling me this whole time, haven't you?" Matthew shrugged innocently, his mischievous smile making William laugh even harder. Emily walked over, carrying a tray of warm pastries. "I see you've managed to outsmart him again," she said, placing the tray on the table. Matthew puffed out his chest with pride. "I'm getting better every game. You're lucky he's a gracious loser," Emily teased, giving William a pointed look. "Not everyone takes losing so well." William smirked, his gaze holding hers for a moment too long. "Maybe I'm letting him win, or maybe he's just that good." Emily quickly averted her eyes, busying herself with clearing away empty cups despite her best efforts to keep things professional. She couldn't deny the warmth growing between them. William was proving himself in ways she hadn't expected, but the wounds of the past weren't so easily forgotten. Later that afternoon, as the cafe quieted down, William approached Emily at the counter. "I was thinking," he began, his tone hesitant, "maybe I could help out here more often. I know how much this place means to you, and I'd like to be useful." Emily raised an eyebrow, her skepticism clear. "You, helping in a cafe? I don't think your tailored suits are made for dishwashing." William chuckled. "I'll leave the suits at home. I mean it, Emily. I want to contribute, not just for Matthew, but for you too." She studied him for a moment, her defenses instinctively rising. "This place isn't just a hobby, William. It's how I've supported myself and Matthew all these years. I can't have you coming in and treating it like some charity project." "I wouldn't dream of it," William said sincerely. "I know how hard you've worked for this. I just want to be part of it, if you'll let me." Emily hesitated, her instincts battling with the small flicker of hope she couldn't quite suppress. Finally, she nodded. "Fine, but don't expect any special treatment. If you're working here, you're starting at the bottom." William smiled. "Deal." The next morning, William arrived at the cafe in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, a far cry from his usual polished appearance. Emily handed him an apron and pointed him toward the sink. "Your first task," she said, her tone teasing, "is dishes. Lots of dishes." William rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Much to the amusement of the cafe staff, while he struggled at first, nearly dropping a plate and soaking himself with the sprayer, his determination quickly won them over. By midday, William had settled into his new role, helping Matthew clear tables and even attempting to take a few orders. Customers who recognized him as the once powerful businessman found the sight of him pouring coffee both surprising and endearing. "You're not half bad at this," Emily admitted as they worked side by side behind the counter. "Maybe there's hope for you yet," William grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the day wore on, Emily found herself loosening around him. She couldn't deny that his efforts were genuine. He didn't complain about the work, and he seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time in the cafe, even if it was a far cry from the boardrooms he once commanded. That evening, after closing the cafe, the three of them sat together at a table. Sharing a plate of leftover pastries, Matthew was recounting his day with the kind of enthusiasm that only a 7-year-old could muster. "And then Dad spilled coffee all over his shoes," Matthew said, laughing so hard he could barely finish the sentence. William groaned, though he couldn't hide his own smile. "Let's not make that a regular occurrence, okay?" Emily chuckled, shaking her head. "You survived your first day. I'm impressed." "Thanks," William said, his tone more serious now. "I know it's just a small start, but..." It feels good to be part of something real. Emily met his gaze, her defenses softening just slightly. You did well, she said quietly. But this isn't just about one day. It's about consistency. I know, William replied, and I'm ready for that. As the weeks passed, William became a steady presence at the cafe. He didn't just help with the day-to-day operations. He also brought new ideas to the table. He suggested small changes to streamline the workflow and helped Emily explore opportunities to expand their menu. Though she was initially resistant, she had to admit that some of his ideas were good. Great. Even one evening, as they reviewed the week's sales figures together, Emily found herself saying something she hadn't expected. You're actually pretty good at this, you know. William looked up, his expression one of genuine gratitude. That means a lot, coming from you. Emily felt a warmth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She still wasn't ready to fully trust him, but for the first time, she began to see the possibility of a future where they could work together, not just as parents, but as partners. The sound of laughter echoed through the cafe as Matthew explained one of his math puzzles to a curious customer. William leaned against the counter, watching his son with pride. It was a scene he'd never expected to be part of, but one that now felt like home. Emily worked beside him, organizing the day's receipts. Over the past few weeks, her guarded demeanor had softened. Not entirely, but enough for William to feel a glimmer of hope. He knew, however, that her trust was still fragile. He had to prove, not just to her, but to himself, that he was here to stay. That evening, as the cafe emptied and the last of the chairs were stacked, William lingered at one of the tables. Deep in thought, Emily approached, setting a cup of tea in front of him. Something on your mind? She asked, her tone curious but cautious. William nodded, staring at the steam rising from the cup. I've been thinking about everything I've missed with Matthew. With you. Emily folded her arms, her expression guarded. You can't change the past, William. I know, he said quickly, but I can change the future. I want to be here, for both of you, not just as Matthew's father, but as someone you can rely on. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. Words are easy, she said quietly. I've heard promises before, William. What makes this time different? William met her gaze, his eyes steady. This time, I know what's at stake, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove it to you. Emily studied him for a long moment, before nodding slightly. We'll see, over the next few days. William threw himself into helping at the cafe and spending time with Matthew. The three of them began to fall into a rhythm. Morning routines, shared meals, and quiet evenings spent working on puzzles or reading together. For the first time, it felt like they were a real family, but Emily still wrestled with her doubts. Late one night, after putting Matthew to bed, she sat alone in the kitchen, her thoughts swirling. Could she truly forgive William for the years of absence and pain? And if she did, could she trust him to stay? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She opened it to find William standing there, holding a stack of papers. What's this? She asked, her brow furrowing. William hesitated before handing them to her. It's everything. The state of my company, the debts, the mess I'm trying to clean up. I want you to see it all. Emily flipped through the pages, her eyes widening as she realized the extent of his struggles. Why are you showing me this? Because I want you to know that I'm not perfect, William said. I've made mistakes, huge ones, but I'm trying to fix them, and I want you to know that I'm not hiding anything from you. Emily stared at him, her heart aching. You're really laying it all out there, aren't you? I am, William said, because if I'm going to ask you to trust me, I need to be honest about everything. Emily set the papers down and sighed. This doesn't erase the past, William, but it's a start. The following weekend, the three of them decided to spend the day at a nearby park. They packed a simple picnic and brought along Matthew's kite, which he was determined to fly higher than ever. The crisp autumn air was filled with laughter as Matthew raced across the field, the kite soaring behind him. As Emily and William watched from a bench, she turned to him, her expression thoughtful. Matthew's happy, she said softly. Happier than I've seen him in a long time. William nodded, his gaze fixed on his son. He deserves to be happy, and so do you, Emily. She looked at him, her defenses wavering. It's not that simple, William. I've spent years protecting myself and Matthew from getting hurt. Letting you in, it's terrifying. I understand, William said, his voice steady. But I'm not going anywhere, no matter how long it takes. I'll be here. Emily's heart ached at the sincerity in his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he could be the man Matthew needed, and the partner she'd once hoped for. But trust, she knew, would take time. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Matthew ran over to them, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Mom, Dad, did you see how high it went?" Emily smiled, ruffling his hair. "We did, sweetheart. You did an amazing job." William placed a hand on Matthew's shoulder, his expression filled with pride. "You're incredible, Matthew. Just like your mom." Matthew beamed, his joy infectious. In that moment, as they sat together, Emily allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something lasting. That night, as they returned to the cafe, Matthew fell asleep on the couch while Emily and William sat in the quiet kitchen. She turned to him, her voice soft but firm. "You've done a lot to prove yourself, William, and I see the effort you're putting in, for Matthew and for me. But this isn't just about what you've done so far. It's about what you'll keep doing." William nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, and I'm ready." Emily took a deep breath, the weight of her fears slowly lifting. "Then let's take this one day at a time." A small, genuine smile crossed William's face. One day at a time sounds perfect. For the first time in years, Emily felt a sense of peace. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But as she looked at William and Matthew, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they could face it together. The early morning light filtered through the windows of Home Plate, casting a warm glow over the cafe. Emily stood behind the counter, carefully arranging fresh pastries on the display trays. The scent of baked goods filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversation as regulars trickled in for their morning coffee. At a table in the corner, William and Matthew sat together, their heads bent over a sheet of paper. Matthew was chattering excitedly about a new idea for a science project, his hands gesturing animatedly as William listened intently, offering suggestions here and there. Emily paused for a moment, leaning against the counter as she watched them. There was something undeniably heartwarming about seeing them together, the way William had seamlessly become part of Matthew's world. It was a sight she hadn't dared to imagine just a few months ago. Later that day, as the cafe bustled with activity, William approached Emily with a hesitant smile. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone careful, "about how much this place means to you. And now to me, I want to help you grow it." Emily raised an eyebrow, her skepticism immediate. "You've already been helping." "William, what are you getting at?" "I mean more than washing dishes and serving coffee," he explained. "I've been running some numbers looking at potential ways to expand. A second location maybe, or adding catering services. I'd like to invest in the cafe, not as a business move, but as a way to support what you've built." Emily stared at him, her emotions conflicting. "You want to invest in the cafe? Why now?" "Because I believe in what you've created," William said earnestly. "This isn't about me trying to take over. It's about giving you the resources to make this place even more successful." Emily hesitated, her instincts warning her to tread carefully. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. Sincerity. He wasn't offering out of guilt or obligation. He genuinely wanted to help. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her tone guarded, but not dismissive. "That's all I'm asking," William replied, a small smile crossing his face. That evening, after the cafe had closed and Matthew was tucked into bed, Emily sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. William joined her, the comfortable silence between them broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden chairs. "You've changed," Emily said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. William looked up, surprised. "I hope so," he said. "For a long time I didn't realize how much I needed to, but being here, with you and Matthew, it's shown me what really matters." Emily nodded, her gaze steady. "You've been consistent, and I appreciate that. But this isn't just about Matthew anymore. If we're going to move forward, we need to be honest about what we want." William leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I want this. Us. I want to be the father Matthew deserves. and the partner you can trust. I know I can't undo the past, but I'm here now. For good." Emily's heart raced as she absorbed his words. For years, she had carried the weight of his absence, the pain of his choices. But now, as she looked at the man sitting across from her, she saw someone who was willing to fight for their future. "I want that too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's going to take time." "One day at a time," William said, echoing the promise they had made weeks ago. Emily smiled, the smallest hint of hope breaking through her walls. One day at a time. The next morning, the cafe was alive with its usual energy. Matthew sat at his favorite corner booth, working on a new puzzle, while Emily and William prepared for the lunch rush. The sight of them working together felt natural, like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. As the day went on, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, she believed they could face it together by the end of the day. As the cafe emptied, and the three of them sat together over a shared plate of cookies, Matthew looked up at his parents with a wide smile. "This was the best day ever," he declared, his voice full of childlike certainty. Emily and William exchanged a glance, their smiles matching, for Matthew, for themselves. They were ready to build a future, one step, one day, one moment at a time.